Okay people, so we're here to look at question 3 of the AQA English Language GCSE paper 2, and it also pops up on paper 1 as question 2, so it's the common question from paper to paper, which is how does the writer use language to something something something. So usually describe the characters, describe a place, describe people, places, whatever it might be. And in this case it's how does the writer use language to describe child prisoners. So this one comes from the KS3 Pack 2 Year 8 from the Secure Key Materials website from AQA, or EAQA. So this text is a letter from Oscar Wilde to a newspaper about the treatment of child prisoners based on his time in Reading prison, Reading jail, or that sort of thing. And in the kind of the preamble, the sort of the blocks at the top of the question, it says to you that he's been imprisoned himself. So it's always really wise to read that first text box before you begin, because it'll give you a nice little summary of what you're about to read. So I did this one as a mock exam at the same time as my students, so that they could, I could sort of remember what doing an exam question feels like under a time restriction, and find out how quick I could be. Yeah, I mean, this is just me, one person's sort of hot take on an exam answer. Obviously, if your teacher teaches you something different and you know a different way of working, don't stress, don't change your whole method of working. But if you feel as though you can pick up some tips, fine. If not, whatever. Don't just completely reverse your judgment based on just one guy on YouTube. Let's be fair, this ain't Logan Paul. I'm not going to tell you to start eating detergent, am I? So just take what you can and leave what you don't need. Alright, so this is obviously a live piece of writing, and I'll try and explain what I did and sort of how and why I did it. Obviously it's not perfect, but it'll be useful for sort of improving and reminding yourself what to do in this kind of question. So you're told at the top of the page to look at lines 1 to 12, so make sure you either mark the page of the source with 1 to 12. I mean, I find it personally very useful to put in lines 1 to 12, the writer makes me feel, or the writer says, or the writer conveys an atmosphere of, whatever it might be. And already I'm using the words make me feel to show the exam marker that I'm going to focus on the effects of the language that the writer has used. It doesn't matter whether I really believe it or not. I'm just faking it until I make it. I'm just sort of pretending that I feel a certain way. I don't necessarily care about these child prisoners from the 1800s, but if I want to hit the 4s and 5s in the GCSE, then I'm going to pretend that I do care. So this is a 12-mark question, so I want to be able to use PEE or PEED for the point evidence explain, and go into detail, or there's another one like PEERZA, so point evidence explain. Say what the reader thinks, zoom into a particular word, do some analysis. I don't, it's up to you. But because it is 12 marks, I'd say get 6 quotes and go for them in depth. So I write my first sentence and I think about finding a quote. So I know I'm limited and I just want to skim over what I've just first read. So I want to say the kids are in a desperate situation, and I decide to just literally use the prison warder and then put it in my own words to say he was sacked for handing out a biscuit, and give a reaction from the reader to say that I feel shocked. So straight away I've got that quote, I need to use a point, and I don't want to write out the massive sentence about the prison warder, which is why I just use that one word warder rather than anything else. So I've been telling my students lately to go for 1 word or 3 word quotes, or even just put on line 2 there's some alliteration, or on line 5 there's a simile, because actually I'm starting to see quotations as a bit of a waste of time. They're great for essays, literature based essays, but the examiner at the end of the day has got the reading material next to them. They have to know the reading material in depth, so actually they'll see a lot of the same quotations used again and again and again and again when they're marking, let's say 400 kids worth of work. So if you just use short quotations or even use line numbers, it's going to save you time. It's going to save you just literally copying out, because you're not going to get marked just for copying stuff down. So I use the words sacked and dismissed to show my understanding of the words from the source, and use the word shocking to show I think that the sacking was extreme, and show that I know that the first fact of the sacking sets the reader up to know that the prisons are quite harsh in the 1800s. I continue on to my next point and pop in the word adjective again to show that I know word classes. It's very simple. Obviously, you know adjective, adverb, strong verb, present participle verb, all that kind of stuff. But the more you use those, the better your answer is going to sound. And what I try to do is pick small amounts of quotes, as you'll see, and string them together in an argument. So in this case, little, hungry, pitiful, small, and then I say that that's going to make us feel sorry for the reader. In this case, I'm looking at kind of malnourishment and the small size of the children. And I don't just keep repeating the word I feel sorry, I feel sorry, I feel sorry all the way through. First of all, I say that the they're in a desperate situation, and then I say we feel sorry for the children, and then I say a bit later on shocking somewhere. So just try and vary what you say. Don't just look at one emotion. You know, we feel sorry, we feel sorry, we feel sorry. It's best to vary it as best you can. So I choose one more word here, confined, and I get a bit self-conscious because I couldn't remember whether in the heat of the moment that was sort of used as an adjective or whatever, but funny enough, that can be used as an adjective, verb, or noun. So, you know, job's good. And I also pick out tiny and tiniest, that sort of thing. So I put that the language like confined creates the impression that the children are kept in small spaces like animals. So I just use the word language rather than saying actually what it really is, just because I'm stalling for time really, and I want to try and say, you know, I wasn't secure about whether it was an adjective. In this case it is. They're confined in a small sort of space. No, there's a noun. Oh crikey, I can't even remember now. But you can say she was in a confined space, which is an adjective. You can say the narrow confines of the school corridor made it feel like a prison. That's a noun. Or you can say he was confined to his bed with a serious case of man flu. That's a verb. So, you know, if you're not sure about what's a verb, what's an adjective, or whatever, just put the language or the word, whatever makes us feel, and that'll kind of get you through a little bit. So I pick out tinier for this next one, and I realise obviously that's an adjective, but actually it's a comparative adjective. So you've got the root word, which is tiny, the comparative, which is tinier, and the superlative, which is tiniest. So comparatives help you compare things, so, you know, small, smaller, and then superlatives are usually the est, so smallest, tiny, tinier, tiniest, small, smaller, smallest, great, greater, greatest. There's loads of them, but it makes your answer sound more analytical if you use words like comparative or superlative adjective rather than just saying there's an adjective, there's an adjective, there's an adjective, there's an adjective. So I use the word sorry again. So I'm just not repeating we feel sorry all the time. I say that the kid is worth feeling sorry for because he's the tiniest one. Just helps explain the language a little bit better. And as you'll see on this next page, there's only 2 pages of actual A4 space. So, you know, no one's asking you to write 3, 4, 5 pages when it's just 2 sides of paper and 12 marks. So get those 6 quotes, be concise, and crack on with that. So at this point I pause for a long time because I'm stalling for time. So I write down the final set of descriptions, but it's quite handy as a sentence to kind of sum up or focus on making a conclusion. So I suggest that the kids are like little frightened animals, which I mentioned before in my answer, but it shows that I've read the text and I've come to my own understanding of it. And the text itself says that some kids look like frightened mice. That's the actual quotation, like mice. So I'm sort of paraphrasing really, but it is showing a little bit of understanding. So I take quite a long time to decide what to write down here. I start to skim over the text yet again and decide to add in that actual quotation about the frightened mice, as you'll see. So I decided to write down the actual quotation about the frightened mice in the end after skimming through the text again, bearing in mind I'm only meant to be looking between lines 1 and 12, so I want to try and prove what I'm saying again. And I noticed actually that quite long quotation, even though I spent time just doing single word quotations earlier, actually that one's quite worth it. So I write down the whole darn thing, like frightened mice in the central hall, with their kind of pitiful prison uniforms or clothes or whatever, pitiful prison dress, excuse me. And actually I realised that there's a simile and there's some alliteration in there. So pitiful prison and like frightened mice. So it's never too late. You know, it's never too late if you find a language term when you think you're nearly finished your whole answer. Go back and just sling it in, because actually I've mentioned adjectives a lot on the first page. But if I start talking about similes and alliteration on the second page, that's fine. You know, semantic fields is fine, personification is fine, all those language terms you would have learnt by now. You know, don't be scared to make your essay go into a bad structure. You don't have to make it all logical and sequenced if you find something really awesome to write about in the final 30 seconds of you writing your answer. That's absolutely fine. So I pop that one in. And I try to explain sort of the word pity a little bit as well, by using the word vulnerable and scared, probably scared too, to sort of show my own understanding. And I try and start off yet another conclusion. So I started writing one conclusion and then it became a paragraph, and I'm trying to do another conclusion right now to put overall the language something, and I pause for a long time again. So I keep flipping back and forth and looking at the text, looking at what I've written already to remind myself of what the actual question asks, because I really want to, you know, write a good summary. So I use another variation on the word pity. You can use sorrow, shock, and this time I go for the word sympathy. So overall the language makes us feel sympathetic to the children, and so on and so on. And that's pretty much the end. So by the end of that, it's 10 minutes, 12 marks, 6 quotations, and even if 3 of those are single word quotes from different places in the text, I've used 4 keywords, or sort of 5, so adjective, comparative adjective, simile, alliteration, and I kind of copped out with the word language because I'd forgotten it was a comparative adjective. And then, you know, really, this answer is not perfect by any means. You know, I make a few grammar mistakes when I put to makes us feel. I cross out the word repeat on page 1. I write down that conclusion of, you know, the final set of descriptions makes us feel, when actually I'm not really finished the answer, and what I call the final set of descriptions is my final set of descriptions, not actually what line 12 out of lines 1 to 12 says. I put double L in central when it's not needed. I use some scruffy handwriting. You know, these things are all fine. It's okay for this to be scrappy, scruffy, whatever. So basically, my top tips for sort of question 3 of paper 2 and question 2 of paper 1. Alright, so I hope that was sort of vaguely useful. Obviously you can pause, you can look at what I've said. Probably I'll try and put the script for this whole thing that I wrote about my answer in the link below, so you can see how I go about it and what I've written. But my top tips really for question 3 of paper 2 and also question 2 of paper 1 for the new AQA GCSE English Language is so make sure you only pick quotations from the set lines. If it says look at lines 1 to 12, only look at those lines. Or if it says look at line 53 to the end of the text, only pick stuff from those lines, because you risk not getting marked for evidence outside of that bit, even if it's a really good point. It will depend on the judgment of the examiner at the time and whether their team leader agrees with it, but you know, just make sure you stay in the confines of the question. Obviously use quotations, but don't copy out 3-line, 5-line, 7-line quotations. Copying is very comfortable. You know, we can all copy things down. We all like kind of writing things down and getting the satisfaction of having done a lot. But you know, put 3 words at a time, you know, or 1 word at a time, or put in line 5 the writer uses alliteration. In line 7 the writer uses a simile. In line 9 the writer has got some personification, or in line 9 or 12 there's a metaphor about the rain. Be clever, you know, don't waste your time copying out loads of quotations when, you know, the examiner is supposed to have the stuff next to them from AQA, and they have to read it, they have to have gone through it, they would have been to a training course about the text. They need to know it, you know, inside out to mark your responses. So don't be afraid of just saying in line whatever, because personally I'm starting to feel now that copying out quotations is a waste of time. I might be wrong, I could be wrong, but hey. Obviously show an understanding of the source by putting things in your own words. So maybe there's a tone of misery, or there's some conflict, or the writer generates sympathy, or the writer generates tension or suspense or horror, or it's a horrific moment because, or it's a, that sort of thing. Often in exams it won't be texts that are too extreme, so it'll usually be things that are quite sort of applicable to the whole nation. 500,000 students sit in GCSE English language each year. It's going to be nothing graphic, but it's going to be tension, action, a climax, an emotional moment, a sad moment, a happy moment, a sudden cliffhanger, a twist, all those kinds of things that also go into structure. Make sure you sort of mention tone, structure, mood, atmosphere, whatever you want to call it. Choose a way to go about the whole text. So I said hunger first, and then the small size of the children, and then the one being the tiniest one in particular. So I had like a sequence of stuff I wanted to say and stuck to that sequence of stuff. Don't be scared of going back over something. If you find a point in the last 5 minutes of writing your answer and you want to sling it in, it doesn't matter. We're not looking for perfectly structured essays in these exams. We're looking for things that are your saying, things that you're reacting to, things you're interested in. So if you find a point in the last 2 minutes and you don't want to rewrite the whole thing, of course you haven't got time to do that. So just bang it in at the end. Put a little asterisk if you want to say, new paragraph, whatever. Put in a wee little concluding sentence of overall, in conclusion, to sum up my ideas, or in this extract the writer has, or I feel that the language the writer uses here is something, 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 just to sort of round off the answer. It just always kind of sounds nice when you read an answer that has a conclusion and reminds the examiner of the question you've just answered. Kind of just sort of rounds it off nicely. So if I was going to improve my answer and critique my own thing that I've written, I would talk about tone that the writer uses. So he says stuff like, it's with great regret that I write my letter to your newspaper. Or he says things like, I saw 3 children myself, because he's been in prison himself. He said things like, I had of course seen many children. Or the little child I saw on Monday the 17th. So Oscar Wilde is always very specific about what he's writing about. He gives examples. He uses pronouns, myself, or it's with regret I feel this way. So he's kind of almost sort of persuading you to be sympathetic towards these children, even though you don't know them. They're not any concern of yours in particular, and certainly the audience he's writing for wouldn't. A Victorian audience in the majority would have thought punishment is good, rehabilitation no. Prison is punishment, not a rehabilitation. He basically qualifies all these statements and says that prisons are terrible for these children. So, if the question is, how does the writer use language to describe these child prisoners, it's to make us feel empathy, sympathy, make us feel sorry for them, or make us pity them, or realise actually how harsh the prisons were in the 1800s. It's just a long kind of a bunch of things. But if in your head already you go in and you will say, okay, I'm going to look at sympathy, I'm going to look at tension, I'm going to look at fear, I'm going to look at any kind of persuasive way a text can be, then just pop it into your answer and job's good. Anyway, I hope that was vaguely useful, and I've been me, Mr. Langley, Brian Langley. You've been you. I hope this has been decent. And as the young people would say to me, safe, or normal, or what was the other one the other day? Trust.